Well, good morning. I'm Judy Corsillo with the National Association for Alternative Certification. I'm joined today by Belinda Gimbert, who's from the Ohio State University, and she represents the Mobilizing National Educator Talent Transition to Teaching program, and Frank Lavoie from the University of Delaware, and Rob Gray from the University of Delaware, and they represent the Delaware Alternative Routes to Teacher Certification program and the Delaware Transition to Teaching program, two programs that recruit statewide. So, I apologize. Okay, so first a little about NAAC. So the National Association for Alternative Certification, of course, is a professional organization, and we advocate for the recruitment, selection, preparation, support, and retention of teachers through alternative pathways. Our flagship event is an annual conference. It brings together program directors, state agency administrators, school district personnel, researchers, people from other national nonprofits, all to share best practices related to recruitment, preparation, retention. We also publish a peer-reviewed journal, the Journal of the National Association for Alternative Certification, which is online at jnac.com, and that just promotes more research into alternative pathways. We recognize the success of alternatively certified teachers through our annual awards for outstanding new educators prepared through alternative certification programs. Through our website, we offer a national database. That's an excellent recruitment tool that I'll talk more about in a second. We've also recently published a retention study looking at retention rates of alternatively certified teachers. So the national database is a collaboration between NAAC and the nonprofit Center for Career Changers to the Classroom. So as you can see by the screenshot, this is a resource where prospective teachers can search for programs by state. For each state, this is an example from California, each state, it's complete with information about the different certification requirements in that state, different pathways, both traditional and alternative, and then a listing of actual programs. Programs submit the information themselves. It's very detailed. It's information about entry requirements, course requirements, clinical experiences, fees, deadlines, et cetera. So if you would like to be added to the database, we update it every summer, and there's a template at the ccteach.org website. And so we encourage programs that are not yet in the database to submit that information, which will be used by prospective teachers. So, there's been a lot of focus on enrollment in teacher preparation programs declining pretty dramatically in recent years. However, we look closely at the numbers reported through the HEA Title II reporting system. And in fact, in alternative certification, we've seen a reversal of this trend and started to see increased enrollments in our programs. So if you look at 2012-13, there were about 56,000 enrollees in programs across the country. By the next year, that had increased to over 59,000. And by 2014-15, we were looking at almost 61,000 enrollees in alternative certification programs. And in fact, if you look at the next line in the non-IHE-based programs, the districts and the RESAs and the ESCs, that trend started a year earlier. And so we think when the 2015-16 numbers will be coming out, we'll see a continual increase in this trend. Rob, if I forget to advance the slides, please do so for me. All right, AltCert programs have not only had recent success in recruiting more teachers into their programs, but they've had good success, according to the Title II numbers, in attracting a more diverse pool of participants than traditional certification programs. So this is important, of course, due to the changing demographics of our student population. The National Center for Education Statistics most recently reported or predicted that by 2024, our non-white student population will be at 54%. If we want to reach all students, it's important that our educator population more closely matches the population of our students. This report just came out in April on the impacts of same-race teachers. published by the IZA Institute of Labor Economics, and it, quantifies some of the reasons why it's important to have same-race teachers. In fact, they found that for African American low-income students, if they were matched in third, fourth, or fifth grade to a same-race teacher, they actually performed better on standardized tests. They had significantly reduced dropout rates in high school, and it increased the likelihood that they would aspire to attend a four-year college. So again, looking at the Title II numbers and a recent report from the Department of Ed entitled "The State of Diversity in the Educator Workforce," we see that alternative certification programs have been very successful in attracting minority candidates. Alternative certification programs also have more, I apologize. I'm getting ahead of myself on the slides. But anyway, this is just sort of a more specific look at the program diversity for African American and Latina candidates. And as you can see, the non-IHE-based programs actually come in at 18% enrollment. So we also have good diversity of gender in alternative certification programs. While traditional programs tend to enroll 23% male candidates, again, according to Title II numbers, it's as high as 34% enrollees, male enrollees in alternative certification programs. And finally, alternative certification programs have been shown to enroll more candidates in the persistently high-need areas where teacher shortages are so severe. Alternative certification programs have proportionally more candidates in the high-need areas of mathematics, ESL, and special ed and science than traditional programs. So why are alternative certification programs successful at this recruitment and enrollment of diverse candidates? They work with their candidates to determine the needs of their hiring districts and use that information to inform their recruitment into the prep program. They've successfully honed their recruitment efforts to target and attract more males and non-white candidates. They've designed their programs to offer flexibility and individualization, and this has attracted many of the prospective teachers, those who already have bachelor's degrees, those who are career changers later in life and want to get into teaching. So they've really been flexible in the design of their programs. And we'd like to think it's all of the above. So the flip side of recruitment, obviously, and the other thing we're going to be discussing today is retention. We need to do a better job of retaining teachers. The good news is that we're actually doing a better job of retaining teachers than we often think, especially in very recent years. So the really dire situation of a decade ago when teachers were leaving the classrooms at rates of up to 50% in the first 5 years is actually starting to improve. If you look at the report from the National Center for Education Statistics, they looked at the beginning teacher longitudinal study, the cohort that began teaching in academic year 2007 and 2008, and looked at the retention for the next 5 years through 2011, 2012, and in fact found that after 5 years, 77% had taught for all 5 years. And then there were additional teachers who had left and come back, but we're at 77%. And moreover, the rates were pretty much the same, whether the teachers went through alternative certification programs or traditional certification programs. I mentioned earlier that NAC recently published a retention study. You can find it in our journal at jnac.com in the fall 2016 issue. In this study, the researchers basically looked at 3-year retention rates of alternatively certified candidates who began teaching in 2010, 2011. The survey was done in 2 phases. So in the first survey, and they looked at programs from 15 different states, I'm not sure of the number of programs in each cohort, but 15 different states were represented. In the first cohort, there were 1,329 completers, and they found 3-year retention rates of 83%. And in the second cohort, 634 completers and 3-year retention rates of 92%. So we have some success stories from specific programs, like the ones represented on the panel today. The Mobilizing National Educator Talent, MNET program, in their 5-year evaluation report, indicated that of the 1,337 teachers that went through, have been certified through MNET over 5 years, they had an overall retention rate of 82% for cohorts 1 through 4 by year 5. Okay, and in the Delaware Alternative Routes to Teacher Certification program, a recent report by Tembo that was delivered to the Delaware General Assembly reported that they had 3-year retention rates of 86% for their Delaware ARTC candidates and 6-year retention rates of 74%. And that was compared to 79% and 63% respectively for the traditional programs in Delaware. And I Teach Texas is another NAC member program. Not on the panel today, but Diane Huber is speaking at another session down the hall right now. And that's a very large program in Texas, and they certified 5,460 public school teachers in Texas from 2004 through 2009, and commissioned a report that shows their 3-year retention rates of 86%. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Belinda.
You need me to hold it. Okay, well, I'm just going to pretend this is a really nice, cold Aussie beverage, and I will hold it right here. Thanks again for coming to the session. Part of the time is we're going to have you engage in activity to help you to understand how we have really connected the words retention and recruitment through partnerships. I'd like to just introduce two of our partners are sitting in the room with us who are part of the Mobilizing National Educator Talent. Philippe Uninsky, if you just raise your hand, is our what we call third-party or external evaluators who are responsible for our formative and summative assessment data with us and play an integral role in helping us to understand what that data tells us as we move through the processes on a quarterly basis. So not waiting until the end of the year to be able to give us data to make changes to our program, but to make those changes as the processes are unfolding. Jay Minchney is from Educational Solutions here in Washington, D.C., and he partners with us around the scope of work related to the D.C. public schools and also some of the charter schools within D.C. So, Mobilizing National Educator Talent, we long abandoned the idea of trying to take the first letters of all the states that we work with and turn them into some fancy acronym that we were able to do in our previous work. Our previous work was called KNOT. It symbolized the collective effort of 4 states: Kansas, Nevada, Ohio, and Texas. That work was really couched in understanding how a collective effort can generate both fiscal and efficacious efficiency. So it's if we take our resources and we take our expertise, how do we collectively unfold work across states, knowing that our teacher shortage issue is it's related to a geographical redistribution problem that we have in the US. So the states that we worked with, if somebody like to hit, that'd be great. The states that we worked with are listed there. And the partners that we worked with as well. The work from NOT encouraged others to reach out to us and say, we believe that we can contribute to the work of NOT, and we believe that we can also learn from what you've been doing across that previous work in terms of recruitment, training, and retention. So we proposed in 2009 the scope of work around MNET, and this time we aim to recruit, retrain, and train 1,111 teachers. In fact, we've been able to recruit 1,337 participants, and some of those are still in our cohort 4 that are finishing off in this year. The flexibility when you work across states, if you look at the glass half full, rather half empty. So instead of thinking about all those bureaucratic nightmares that we have in terms of licensure and certification, but if you think of what you can do to support school systems' needs in terms of staffing, then when the recession hit in 2008 and some school systems were having to lay off teachers, even though they were high need and hard to staff, there were others that were partnering with us that were saying, we are hiring more special ed, we're hiring more English learners, ESL, TESOL teachers. So we were able to work to be able to still support greater numbers in some school systems, while the fiscal cliff was addressed in other school systems. And then once we moved past 2008, we were able to come back together and say, okay, now let's look at those staffing needs of all our 158 school systems and where are the needs now. It also generated that collective sense of empathy in that school systems could say, this is not just about me. I do belong and work with something that's bigger than me. And I can see that school system in Texas at Killeen has this huge need for special ed. What can I offer them in terms of support as well? So it wasn't just the numbers. It wasn't just reporting the GAPRA to Congress. It's not just about recruiting, training, and retaining. It's also about how we understand our daily sense of work in school systems, at universities, who for the long time have driven this process and for a long time needed to take a back seat in how we collectively do this work and really generate to Congress where are the areas that we've grown. So if we could hit the slide button. I'm going to let you. Do you mind doing it, Judy?
No, I don't.
So this work, Richard Ingersoll and I have worked collectively and communicated over the years around, let's get a perspective. I'm Aussie, and believe it or not, Australia is geographically the same size as the US. Most people don't realise that. But we only have 7 states, and you've got, my last count, 50, right? Okay? So when I taught in central New South Wales, it was 200 miles to our nearest what we called cluster buster duster. That's the superintendent, right, for our collective schools. They were that far away. Now, if you think that they could get there in a hurry to make any major change, no, that didn't happen. And so when I think about where I work right now in Ohio, instead of 7 school districts like we still have in New South Wales, there are 521 school districts, and there's almost as many public and charter schools. We call them community schools. So that's a huge difference in how you manage people. So let's talk about the teacher shortage that we have and the labour force that we have in the US. And honestly, I could be standing now in Australia and having very similar conversations about our own teaching force in Australia as well. So this is a global shared dilemma. So what we do know is that the teaching force is larger than it has ever been. In fact, since 1987 to 2012, our teaching force has 2.5 times increased. The number of students has only increased by 20%, but the number of teachers has actually increased by 46%. We're greyer. And I think that was kind of emphasised in the activity we did this morning when many of us stood and we sort of started to realise that we are a little greyer. Despite having a 15-year-old, we're all tending to get a little bit greyer. So we're older. However, Richard's work also shows us the number of math and science teachers that are being prepared do equal the number of teachers that are retiring. But the problem is we're not preparing them where they need to be hired. And so we have this movement issue of not being able to distribute them from Ohio State, where we produce middle school and high school math teachers, to Clark County, who have 1,000 vacancies across their teaching workforce right now. So we're greener. We have this bimodal. So we've got this bump. We've got green, and then we've got a dip in our mid-careers, and then we have an increase in the grey, the ones that are heading towards retirement. And there has been, but it's not a new trend, as emphasised by many of these non-traditional alternative certification programs, is that there has been an increase in the number of individuals who are interested in becoming teachers who are over 29. And we refer to them as mid-careers, but again, it's not a new trend. That's been around in the US since the early 1980s. The changes in the number of those coming in have definitely increased, but it's something we've known about. We're even more female. Almost 8 in 10 in our teaching force are female, and that has increased. In fact, in 1981, 67% were female, and in 2012, there's now 76%. I mean, we used to talk about, just in our elementary schools, how feminized or how many females were in the elementary. Now it is moved through, and we need to figure out why that is the case as well. We're more diverse by race and ethnicity. The issue is that we are also not retaining many of our racially diverse educators. And then, believe it or not, and again, I'm using some of my Aussie vernacular, and in some ways, I'm sorry this is being recorded, we might have to bleep out a few things, but the teaching force is not dumber than it was in 1987. Sometimes we hear about our teachers that they are now not as cognitively able, that they don't have necessarily as high admission scores around content proficiency. In fact, that is not a case. When we look at Barron's classification, and if we just use simply the categories from the 2 top categories from higher ed institutions, about 10% come from the 2 highest categories, about 20 to 25% come from the lower categories of institutions of higher ed, and that's about 65 to 70% of first-year teachers come from those middle-level institutions, and that hasn't changed since the early 1980s. What we do know is that our teaching force is far less stable. We have a relatively high rates of departures of teachers, and just to give you some numbers, in 1987, 6,000 left. Have left since 2007, 2008, and I'm sorry, in 1987 about 6,000 teachers left, and in 2008 about 25,000 teachers left teaching. So that's about 4 times as many. So we have an increase in our attrition rate. So what do we know about this teacher shortage? Do we really have a teacher shortage, or do we really have an attrition issue and a redistribution problem? So there are a couple of things. What we do know is teacher shortages are really unevenly distributed, and especially in special ed, some of the sciences, and the higher level math content. Again, we need to talk some specifics about sciences. Physics and chemistry, yes. Not so much biology. Yes, earth science can be also problematic. And of course, we do have, it's in specific types of schools. It's our urban, it tends to be rural, it also high poverty, high minority, and our chronically low performing schools. So this is interesting to me too. The number of education degrees has increased since 2010. But in the STEM and the special ed, those degrees remain pretty flat, and only 50% of education degree earners in the past 30 years actually were employed as teachers. And that's also very similar to some of our other similar economies, such as Australia. So the question I think we have to ask ourselves is, what teacher supply and demand data can effectively capture the quality of an applicant pool at a local level to resolve some of these teacher shortage? That's a question that we as a community need to be asking ourselves. All right, there's an imbalance, a disparity between retention. So we're retaining smaller numbers, we're recruiting larger numbers. And I think that's important to remember. We are recruiting larger numbers, but we're not retaining them. The numbers that we're retaining are smaller. And that means that we have higher attrition rate. Let's put it in perspective as well. If over all of our teacher labour force, so we include our novices, say 1 to 5 years, and we include our mid-career, and those that have been in teaching for more than 15 years, our attrition rate is at about 8%. Does this create us a challenge? If we compare to Singapore and we compare to Finland, you see their retention. Now I start getting a little antsy. This is when the Aussie again comes out in me, is that we look very different in our country from Singapore and from Finland. So context is incredibly important. But it does give us just some ballparks to play in terms of, okay, we're at 8%, and some of these other countries, Singapore and Finland, what are their retention rates? So about a third leave in the first 3 years, and Judy did give you some data to think about, which does sort of say to us we are improving in terms of our attrition. I think there's also a question that we need to think about is school systems, particularly the chronically low performing and hard to staff, often have a very high internal attrition rate. And that's where we have to think about how does that high internal attrition rate affect some of our local conditions at the school level, such as working conditions and school climate and implementation of some of our comprehensive induction programs if we're constantly having internal attrition. Columbus City Schools does not have an issue in recruiting teachers. Their internal attrition rate is still somewhere around about 15%. And I worked at Newport News Public School. Anybody here from Newport News Public Schools in Virginia? No. And we also had, very good, we also had a high sort of attrition rate in the early 2000s of around about 20%, but we also had a high internal attrition rate that we needed to address. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what partnerships can we build to sustain a comprehensive talent development approach? We talk about partnerships as though it's just rolling off our tongue, but we've got to get down and talk about what are the kinds and the types of partnerships that are most going to benefit our recruitment and our retention. We also have to talk about zero vacancies, right? Zero vacancies or no attrition rate, it's unrealistic, and it might also not be very healthy. So we have to think about that as well. And the question is, what level of teacher shortage and teacher turnover is acceptable? If you talk to many businesses, they will say, from organizational theory, they need about a 10% turnover every year. Well, it's a little different in the business model where you might be affecting a team of 4 to 5. For us in education, when we're affecting our attrition, high attrition rates and high turnover can affect many classes of 30 students, then we have to think about what are we willing to accept in terms of our teacher turnover. I worked in human resources, and like most of you, there are not everybody that we want to keep as a teacher. We do need to have a healthy exit rate, but we have to figure out what that balance is. And there's a piece there that I know there's data out that talks about the influence of teacher effectiveness and the potential earnings of a child over their lifetime. So the question again is, how can school leaders use teacher effectiveness data for talent development decisions? How do our principals have data that doesn't make them dizzy, that they can use that to make informed decisions about their potential employees at their school? All right, we know that teacher retention matters, and we know it for all of those reasons, and every one of you in those reasons could stand up and recite those even using an Aussie accent. They're the same, okay? If we now go to the next slide, we look at what are some of the dispositions and traits that we recognize that help with retaining a highly effective teacher. Again, is that any different? And we're hearing it talked about yesterday and today, and I know we'll hear more about it tomorrow. There's one there that I just would like to point out. I think it might have actually been on the previous slide. And we're talking a lot about personalized learning and thinking about how that is enacted in the classroom. I think that's a little bit different from what we've thought about in the past about differentiated instruction. But I also think we need to think about personalized learning at the adult level in order to be able to support that in the classroom as well. All right, next slide. All right, R&R, what does that stand for? In the US, what does R&R stand for? What do you think about it? Rest and relaxation. And in our scope of work, that rarely ever happens, right? What we need to think about, I believe, is retention and recruitment. All right, typically, we think about the recruitment first, and then we think about retention. We think who we recruit and the influence, and then we hope that we're going to retain them. One of the goals we have worked on in our work in MNet is thinking about retention and then recruitment. And what kinds of partnerships do we build in order to have, first of all, retention in our minds that will lead to more effective recruitment? So you with me here? It's okay that I'm sort of inversing your thinking, just to kind of flip and think about it. So if we actually inverted our thinking and thought about both our thoughts and our actions, then how can our efforts to retain teachers improve both the numbers of the applicant pool and the quality of the applicants? So if we shift to more of an actionable set of steps around retention, and we sort of review retention as the driver of the recruitment strategies, then the next thought for us when we're working across 14 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico, and 158 school systems is, what partnerships do we need to build, and for what purpose, to meet the goal of a high-quality teacher workforce, both locally and nationally? So here we go. The partners, what we've done is we've tried to generate this synergistic relationship between the retention and the recruitment. And what it enables the LEAs to do is to reduce its attrition rate and to increase the applicant pool, for them to be able to hire, to assign, to grow, to talent manage, and then either renew a contract or dismiss. And undergirding this factor is this relationship between the retention and the recruitment. And it's the strength across the partnerships. It's the school districts, the universities, our state agencies. In the case of Texas, we work with HCDE, the Harris County Department of Education. Who knew that Texas was the only state in the US that has 2 state departments? Did you know that? It's legislated, and Harris County Department of Education has been around since the 1940s, I believe, maybe even a fraction earlier. But yes, so to work with the state agencies, nonprofits, and then local community organizations. And what we've had to do is we've really had to, in the partnership piece, we've had to recognize each other's needs, our strengths, our resources. We've had to do this root cause analysis to really understand what are these reasons behind how we retain in order to recruit, in order to meet the partnering needs sites. So we've really had to take into account all of what I call in the C words, right? The children, the context, the community, the collaboration, curriculum, colleagues. We have to have this equal buy-in. Universities have to be prepared to put their egos to the side. And at The Ohio State University, that takes a fair bit. Put your ego to the side and try to understand how we can generate a system that supports the needs of all of the partners. Okay, here's where you get to do something. I was a high school math teacher, and yesterday, high school in Australia means 7 through 12, grades 7 through 12. So one period I might have had working with fractions with 7th graders, and then the next period I might have had my 3-unit seniors, year 12 students. So we don't teach across grade level, we teach vertically. So you need to grab whatever tool, whether it's paper, whether it's your phone, whether it's whatever, and you need to work with, because this is about partnerships, work with two or three people, and I need you to solve this problem. Solve 3 divided by 3/4. And you have to explain to your other 2 partners and agree how the solution, what was the solution? What solutions did you use to solve that? 3 divided by 3/4. Already? If you can hear me, clap your hands. If you can hear me, pat your partner on the tushy. No, don't do that. right, here we go. All right, somebody volunteer. Thanks, Becky Parker, you volunteered. How did you do? How did your group do 3 divided by 3/4?
Fraction. Multiply and divide into 4.
Okay, so you took 3, you inverted the 3/4 to make its reciprocal, you turned the divided sign into a multiplication, you cancelled to simplify, and your answer became 4. Who else did it some different way? Yes.
We both did it the same way mentally, just thinking about 3/4. How many times that go into 3? Well, it takes 2 of those to make 1.5, and then it takes 2 of those to make 3. So we just kind of, by doubling it, thinking that way, came up with 4.
Very good. Any elementary, middle, elementary? Well, tell us how you did yours.
We used our calculator to.
Use your calculator.
But
Was
we
it-
did it and then went 4. How can it be 4? And then realized because it's a fraction.
Very good. Yes.
We took 3 hulls and we divided each of the hull into 4 pieces, and then we said how many groups of 3 can we get out of those pieces so that they would understand the conceptual understanding and not just do the output.
So you did something like this, right? Very good. Next slide. Okay. Different ways to solve the problem. Use your strengths of the partnership. Address the needs. Let's go to this one. With your group, solve 5 divided by 3/4, and then you need to explain to me why the answer is 6 2/3. Go. You got 30 seconds. All right, now it's time that you can rub the tushy of the person beside you. All right. So the answer is 6 2/3. Why is the answer 6 2/3? How did you get 6 2/3? Lucia, would you explain to us how you got 6 2/3?
The 5 and divided it by 3/4, which you invert to multiply, and so you come up with 20 and over 3, which divided by 3 is 6 2/3.
So the 6 2/3. Not a problem. Somebody else who did it differently. Oh. All right, my team up the back, my conceptual folks. Can you help? Can you explain? Okay. So here we go. Go, Frank.
I just took 5 and divided it by 0.75 in the old division way and moved it over 2 decimal points and worked it out to 0.66666666.
There you go. Got 6 2/3. Okay, so here's I think what I want you to take away is when you solve a fraction conceptually, you will really start to understand what are the pieces that have to make a partnership in terms of individuals' understanding. Conceptually, if you draw 5 circles and then you take to count off the 3/4, you will find that there are 6 lots of 3/4, but there are 2 pieces that remain. It's not 2/3, it's that there are 2 out of 3/4 left, and you need another quarter in order to make another whole 3/4. So the 2/3 isn't just another fraction hanging out there. It's actually you got 2 out of the 3 pieces left that you would need to get another piece, another quarter, to make another entire 3/4. She gets it. Do you get it? Good, because I couldn't tell the light in your eyes, but I could tell the light in her eyes. So when we're working partnerships, all these pieces come together because you have to be able to understand each other's learning needs. What are the goals as the group? And nobody is leaving this room until I am convinced at the end of the presentation that you understand that piece of conceptual math. Because if nothing else, you're going to take that back and you're going to remember this piece when you're working on the partnerships. So partnerships matter for all these reasons. Do you understand procedurally, or are you just doing this work step by step without really understanding the procedural piece of it? But even more important is, do you understand the conceptual work of partnerships? And can you transfer the skills as you're developing these partnerships to do this very important work? All right, quick few examples because I'm way over time. And this PowerPoint is the present, it is actually going to be online, so you can go back and take a look. In terms of governance, all personnel that operate the site's work meet once a month online. We call them strategic planning team meetings. We have to make the most of technology because we are distributed all over the US. In terms of site-based governance, the LEAs partner with universities. They also partner with local for-profit, not-for-profit organizations to develop the teachers, and they're responsible collectively with us to really look up front at the disposition assessments prior to coming into a teacher preparation program. All right, across the partners in terms of governance, we use what's called an IGAP team, and this came up from our partners. They said, we are very big, collectively we are large, and so what they decided to do 2 years ago was to form these IGAP teams, and that means different sites come together and form part of a GAPRA 1 or a GAPRA 2 or a GAPRA 3 team. So it's either around recruitment, the training, or the retention. And each year, they work as part of that team to do root cause analysis at their local sites to try to solve their own problems and to share their expertise. Again, OSU is the umbrella and provides the support and the guidance and the technological infrastructure, but we're not getting in the way of the work at the local site. Next one. In terms of partnerships that support the individual teachers of record, we have e-content that's delivered online through professional learning packages, and we offer e-coaching, and that's what Becky Parker is responsible for. Every night of the work week, there are e-coaching sessions offered online, which is synchronous. We take advantage of OSU because they have a nice online system that we can use for and not have to pay for. And they get on around their content area, and they work with master teachers in terms of pedagogical content knowledge. The district and school leaders, we also have some personalized and virtual learning opportunities, because one of the important pieces that we have not connected well is we talk about supporting school leaders, but really we have to talk specifically about what school leaders need in order to understand how to nurture their novice teacher talent. We have this gap between what administrators know and understand and what they need to do in order to support those beginning teachers. Can skip through that one. And again, to sustain this retention and recruitment, the most important piece that we can do is look at our data, which is provided with and for us for Philippe's group. And in terms of that, it's not just, here's your data, go figure it out. It's what kind of data do we need to collect? What kind of processes do we need to implement in order for our sites to understand the data? What skills and knowledges do we need to grow within ourselves to actually be able to understand and interpret that data? And I think I will just leave those action steps so that Rob and Frank can have their time, and we can go back over with questions around action steps later.
I'm starting. Hi, I'm Rob Gray. I'm the project coordinator for the Delaware Transition to Teaching Partnership through the TTT. And
I'm Frank Lavoie, and I run the coordinator for the Alternative Routes to Certification program that houses the Transition to Teaching grant that Rob has been coordinating.
Nope. He wrote the grant that gave me my job. So let's go. Okay, a little perspective here. This is the United States of America. No, he told me not to. Yeah. There's Delaware. It's that little black dot. There's a reason for this. Our three greatest exports from Delaware are not Joe Biden, Elena Del Don, and Joe Flacco. Seriously, we're more than that. But the upcoming slides, we want you to understand the challenges of running this grant in a very, very, very small state. This small.
How small? We have 19 districts, and some of those districts are so small they have only one high school. They have only one high school, okay. There are 25 charter schools. Most of them are in the northern part of the state where about 60% of the state population live. As you can see, the students are 137,000 and just a little over 9,000 teachers. But the ARTC program, the Alternate Routes to Certification program, which is affiliated with the University of Delaware, accounts for 10% of all new hires each year. And that I think is about a national trend, I would think. But we get phone calls. Because we're so small, we're on a personal name basis with every HR director from every charter school in every district. So we get calls on a regular basis or an email. Hey, Frank, I just had a chemistry teacher quit. Do you have some names for me? That kind of stuff. Let me explain a little bit about the ARTC program in general. I'm going to hold off on that just for a second. ARTC program is mostly for the secondary levels, and it started off being a way to supply the pipeline with critical need subject areas, obviously math, science, technology, but also English, and in the past, art and music have been high need or critical needs in the state of Delaware. Business education teachers as well, and it's expanded beyond that. But we saw what we were doing. We were getting an awful lot of potential candidates who met some minimal requirements. And the way the ARTC program works is you don't start your training for certification until you actually get a job. So someone's got to hire you first and take that leap in faith. Then they go through a series of 5 courses that the state Department of Education requires. They have to pass an additional test that shows that their subject knowledge is strong enough. And they have to get satisfactory teaching evaluations. That's what I inherited about 6 years ago when I came into the program, and I saw that there were some needs there. And one of them was that we need some guidance. We needed some guidance for our first-year teachers who were just drowning in a lot of the details of a first-year teacher. Did some research, and I found that the research supported coaching as a model with an older teacher with whom you could establish a good relationship. So we saw the RFP for Transition to Teaching grant, and we put a grant in and designed that to be a part of UD's ARTC program in general, the alternate routes program in general. We partnered with the University of Delaware, with the Delaware Department of Education, and at the time, the RFP restricted the number of districts we could partner with to those that met the 2009 census definition of high poverty areas. Let me explain to you that probably Newcastle County, Delaware, the northernmost county, could lead the nation in numbers of families that send their students to private schools instead of public schools. So we had high-need schools within districts whose populations were very affluent. So we couldn't use them according to the definition, and that was one of the challenges of being such a small state, because, you know, in a large state like Texas or California, that wouldn't make a difference. But we did partner with a couple of those districts, and fortunately, because Delaware defines charter schools as their own LEAs, we were able to include 1 or 2 other charter schools that had high poverty populations in our partnership. We also offered, as part of that, like, you want to move to the next one, Rob? Thank you. We decided, or we designed the grant to include 4 cohorts over 5 years. The first year was a prep year. 4 cohorts, and our design was to have 15 people, 15 new teachers of record at the end of each year in math, science, technology, and English, not engineering, but English, because that was a high need, critical need subject in Delaware schools, secondary schools at the time. We had pushback from our state Department of Education. Can't you expand that to 25 or 30? And we knew instinctively that that would not be a good idea. So we were able to resist that temptation, because they offered to give us more money if we could do that. And as tempting as that was, we resisted the temptation. Wisely so, as it turned out a couple years later. We serve just high-need secondary schools. That's grades 6 to 12, according to Delaware's definition. And we provided scholarships. Scholarship money. One of the challenges I found when I came to ARTC was we had people who were changing careers and giving up careers with, sometimes we're paying 3 figures to start for $35,000 and $40,000 a year. That was a challenge. And now on top of that, they had to swallow some immediate graduate school tuition. So we made some other arrangements, but this grant allowed us to give scholarship money and tell people, okay, all the coursework you will take, we will cover for you. As long as you make a commitment, not only to the 2 years that you're finishing the program, but an additional 2 years to teach in a high-need school, as defined by the grant. We tried to also target some underrepresented, traditionally underrepresented groups, women in science and technology and math, minorities, veterans, and some disabled populations. We also added a coaching element. I said before that I had done a little bit of research and found that coaching was a really good tool for not only having teachers have a more successful year, first and second year, but to retaining teachers. So we identified some recently retired, excellent, highly effective teachers who were willing to come and work part-time for us. For each of our candidates, we gave them 40 hours of one-on-one coaching on-site, and including videotapes and a strong personal relationship. The other piece of it was they almost became like confessors. I told the coaches that you're not supposed to report out to the principals how they're doing, and you're not supposed to report out to us very specifically how they're doing. I wanted that to be a kind of a sacrosanct relationship where the teacher could just bare their souls about what's working and what's not working, and it really has worked out fairly well. And I think this is, I mentioned that too, underrepresented group, and I jumped that bullet point. We also included an external evaluator, and that external evaluator has really proven to be an important critical friend to us, because they were eyes and ears and data-driven, but we used our evaluators. They attended almost every single training session and visited schools and talked to the teachers, they talked to the principals, they talked to the state coordinators, and they gathered a really good quantitative and qualitative data that we turned around and used in the very next session that we were going to conduct to make some adjustments that were candidate-driven.
Okay, the next couple slides have a very different format. The top are the grant requirements, what we started with. Then we're going to give you very briefly what worked and what didn't work, and these are lessons learned. So recruitment, we ended up with 573 total applicants. The total selected is low, but for Delaware, that's a lot. And that's why we showed you the first slide about Delaware. The biggest issue we had with total selected is the first 2 years we couldn't get them hired. The next 3 years, before we finished training in the summer, non-high need schools were hiring people. They were coming, they were taking them. And when you have a candidate look at you and say, I'm the only breadwinner for my family, this is a great job for me, how do you say no to that? So Tyra was fantastic, and her colleagues were fantastic in advising us with that. So if we were to put in our non-high needs teacher with this group, that number would be much higher. Well, the total selected, that's how many, so when didn't make it through training, the second you got hired by a non-high needs, you're technically out of the program, the funding stops. We advised them they would make the choice anyway. So we only had 29 teachers of record. We were going to recruit from IHEs, veteran groups. At the time, we had a wonderful connection with Troops to Teachers, which has since gone away. That regional person has been instrumental in helping us with recruiting, but that was a big issue. And we were going to focus on job fairs. So what worked? We came up with a radio ad. Boy, was it successful, because we tracked it. It was cheap. They run it for free. We have a teacher who's in radio. He had all the connections. I would strongly advise a radio ad. And stations have to do public service announcements. They love this kind of stuff because they need the time slot and they need to fill that. And you can keep it and then remind them the next year, hey, could you run that ad again? And they pop it in and it's good to go. And it's really neat when you're driving in the car and the ad comes on and you're with your kids and like, hey, you really do work. Yes, I do. Thank you. And then they ask me to pay for things. We had a campus bulletin board, which was phenomenally effective. Unfortunately, it got shut down after the second year. We started going to non-education job fairs. This is another small Delaware thing. We have a fantastic congressional delegation. Coons, Carper, it was Carney. Carney's now the governor. It's now Lisa Blunt Rochester. They hold at least three job fairs a year. We only have 3 counties in Delaware, right? A job fair in each county. It's a nice draw. Everyone shows up. But non-education job fairs is where we found the most teachers. Also, any veterans job fairs or anything like that. In Delaware is a word of mouth. You know, 6 degrees of separation? There's 3 in Delaware. It's no joke. It really is. Okay, first 2 years, people didn't take us seriously, especially recruiting veterans. They're waiting, and somebody said, don't worry, they're waiting to see if you come back. After about 2 years, we just passed this line, and people started taking us for real, and veterans started talking to us because they knew you were coming back. So keep that in mind if you're starting anything new. What didn't work? Believe it or not, recruiting from IHEs. We went to their job fairs, we tracked the data. We did not get a lot of people from IHEs. We have connections with them, but we kind of stopped going to IHE recruiting job fairs. I mean, education job fairs, other job fairs we did. Any advice would be appreciated. We tried everything we could to recruit minorities and to keep them. And it just didn't work out. They have so many other opportunities. We still talk to them, great people. We are continually scratching our head over that one. Okay.
Talk about the selection process. We usually conducted 2 interviews. First was a kind of a screening to see if you were suitable for teaching. And it was Rob and I sat in with the person. We used a pre-screener, but not until about the 3rd year. Is that right, Rob? We got the 2nd year, okay. After the 1st year, we found that there were some people who just weren't suitable for teaching in a high-need secondary school, where there's a lot of challenges, as you know. So we went to an NAAC conference and heard about the Haberman. I don't know if you're familiar with that, the Haberman, okay. And it made all the difference in the world for our first selection. And then we also did a second interview wherein we invited the candidates that we survived the first interview back to, and we gave them a prompt of, if you were to teach, say, a 7th grade class on osmosis, if they were a biology or a chemistry major or science major, or if you were to teach this newspaper article as an English language arts teacher to a 9th grade class whose reading abilities are this range, how would you do it? We're not going to ask you to teach it, but talk to us about how you would present that. And then they had to present that to a group of 5 of us, Rob and I and 3 of our colleagues at the Delaware Center for Teacher Education. And that really made a big difference. Some people came in really brilliantly prepared, nervous as heck. Other people kind of just came in and just off the cuff. And so we knew that those weren't going to be really successful candidates at all. Some of the things that worked for us, again, the 2 interviews worked well. We also had an awful lot of evaluator input, and I mentioned this to you before. Our evaluator really served as a critical friend, and we spoke with them on a regular basis, not just on the reports time. We also tried to, over the couple of years that we were getting started, get partners, the districts and charter schools, to identify more and more in advance where they anticipated their needs. Again, we are a small pool. One year, we had absolutely no math vacancies that had to be filled, believe it or not. And I know that sounds like heresy, but that, you know, I don't know what we were looking at each other. What did we do with our 3 math candidates? Well, fortunately, they were eventually able to find other work in non-high need schools. But we got people to think a little bit more in advance. And again, it takes time for them to think about this as being a real system. The Haberman really worked an awful lot in our favor to identify the right kind of people. One guy who didn't pass the Haberman, by the way, and if you didn't pass DT3P, you could still be eligible for the ARTC program, wound up being offered a job at one of our high-need high schools in downtown Wilmington. And despite our advice, he took it anyway, and 6 weeks later, he left.
So I told him no, don't do it. Bad career move.
But he knew better than us, because he had a PhD, by the way, in chemical engineering.
That was a fun day.
Anyway. And so the Haberman saved us from discovering too late. What didn't work? in our year one, we really didn't have that Haberman as a screen for high need. So this is kind of just a repeat of what we're doing. And we weren't sure, and again, in the very beginning, about what the LEA hiring needs are. We're still not sure exactly, because there's an awful lot of other factors that go into Delaware hiring for schools. Every LEA has to do a tax hike by referendum. About 60 to 75% of funding comes from the state, but for local funds, the school boards are not empowered to raise the taxes. They've got to go to the community. It's the only tax that people in Delaware can vote on. So it's a real struggle each time. So that added to the variability of predicting, what schools would need what teachers. And so we have usually found ourselves in September and October with a flood of requests for teachers long after the school year has started. Too long, in my opinion, but that's the way it works. The other thing is that Delaware funds schools. They release the state monies after a final student count on September 30th. Something, and I've worked in Delaware since 1973, and it just befuddles me why they do that, but it's the way they do it. So that's one of the things that didn't work in being able to predict the hiring needs.
Training. So initially, we started out a summer training program, 60 hours in the summer, clinical field experience of 20 hours. That was my previous job at UD. We'd bring in presenters. The goal was to create usable products. They'd have a lesson plan at the end. We would vary everything based on their input, because we had a fantastic evaluator who evaluated constantly. And we would often bring in the evaluations to the workshop and say, based on what you told us last week, this is what we're doing this week. So there was a continuous evaluation. So what worked was that obvious response to evaluation, because you're demonstrating to them, this is how you use summative and formative assessment. And this is how do you, and we would do things like, now we're going to change based on what you said, and the heads nod. How do you feel about us doing this? We feel empowered, so do it in your room when you teach, and we worked on that one. We had coaches participate in the workshop, which was really nice. We did not start out that way, and that was a mistake. In the beginning over here, what didn't work, their first meeting with their coaches in the first year was the first time they got observed. No good. Second year, we bumped up the hours, again, thanks to Tyra and their advice, changed some things around, brought in coaches. They had a chance to meet with them during the workshops, connect with them, made that first observation go so well. Okay, the first summer, the original grant was we were going to do 3 consecutive weeks, Monday to Friday, all day. We had 17 people in our first cohort. 8 dropped out when they saw the schedule. They said, we're the sole wage earner, we can't do it. And we were terrified, and this is how Washington helped us, because we called and said, we have to change the schedule. And they're like, what's your data? Okay, great idea, change the schedule. So they really, this is our first grant, so they advised us and counseled. There was a lot of counseling. You're okay, go back. So you get the idea. And the limited coaching, and I talked about that. Took a couple years to find a decent summer school site where they could visit. We know it works because our placements were set up this year. When the vice principal will go out to job fair, he said, you sending people? Yeah, we're sending them. Good, talk to me later, boom. We just got 15 placements from that guy. But it took 5 years to get there. And we had some sites that we had to say we're not coming back. And here's why. And we were very careful to articulate why.
We're at 12:35.
Yeah, we gotta really pick it up.
Okay, we don't place people in our program. Our partners are not obligated to hire any of our candidates. And so that's made it a kind of a loose agreement there. But the candidates find the jobs. We, of course, help them do that. And we do some advertising of we put together a little bio profile for each candidate, and we publish that to the HR directors, not only in our partner schools and the high need schools, but all throughout the state. And we teach them some marketing strategies. We show them a model of a one-page resume for education and how to put your best foot forward. We give them practice interviews. Some of our partners will send in some people from their HR department to one of the trainings and just sit and have mock interviews with people. And we also had a job search coach from the State Department of Education. She was a recruitment specialist who really gave invaluable help. What didn't work? Well, again, the non-high need schools were siphoning off some of the best talent that we hand selected and trained, and we couldn't stop that because it's an open economy, and we keep at the free labor market. And of course, uncertain demands for particular content areas. Is it going to be math this year? Is it going to be more science? Is it going to be foreign language, et cetera? And of course, there were economic downturns between the lack of referendum and also the economy in general. Remember where we anticipated some teachers about 10 years ago leaving the profession because they were old enough? Well, when their 403Bs and 401Ks didn't perform the way they needed to for retirement, they stuck it out, and there go the openings. And in a state as small as Delaware, that rocks your world. Okay, retention. Basically, our coaches help that with retention. They've got 40 hours and sometimes more when needed, and we've even done that. The coaches have dug in and become part of improvement plans for some of our early faltering teachers. They met the candidates during the summer and established a good, strong relationship. And Rob, the grant coordinator, has already a strong relationship with partners and other HR directors and building principals. That really helped because he was able to go in early and put out some fires, and that was able to save someone who might have otherwise washed out. What didn't work? The Delaware RIF process. Every year, anybody who has 1, 2, or 3 years experience expects a pink slip around this time of year. Because if they don't get if they don't get that letter by May 15th, they automatically get hired for the next year. And because the state doesn't release the money till September 30th, districts are very antsy about committing to more teachers than they'll get funding for, because the difference between a state-funded teaching unit and a locally funded school teaching unit is very big. So there's an awful lot of instability there, and they get very, very nervous. Of course, one of the reasons why of retention is there's challenges in high-need schools. We know that. You all know that. And there's better money outside teaching in a high-need school district. If I can make more money and I have less aggravation, why not?
Okay. Very briefly, how DOE partnered with us. They helped us to expand the number of ELAs working within their definition to include charter schools, which was very nice. A couple conference calls. Through their help and guidance, we were able to expand the grant to include other content areas based on what partner districts were saying to us they needed. Thank you for that. Don't need to talk about that. And it was more advising us, what's your data say? When we were coming back and saying, we only have this many hired, yeah. But you'll see the next slide, and we realized over time, this is what they were interested in.
So DT3P and ARTC in Delaware, hiring in Delaware in general for teachers has changed thanks to the DT3P grant. I like to think about a quotation from a Thornton Wilder play called The Matchmaker, where Dolly Levy says, money is like manure. It's got to spread around to make things grow. Well, the DT3P grant, Transition to Teaching grant, is like manure. Okay, it has helped an awful lot of young things grow and get stronger. Too much manure, as you know, can burn a crop. So too much reliance on that kind of money is not good at all. But I think it worked really well for us in Delaware. And for example now, coaching is a regular part of the state expectation. Well, state-funded grants, RFPs came out, and coaching was a necessary part of that. A pre-screener is now a part of the common application in Delaware. And there are several new alternate routes pathways, as Rob pointed out to you. The state has even reached out to DT3P, and particularly Rob, for our efforts to help recruiting for all traditional and non-traditional teacher prep programs. We want to recruit more teachers in Delaware. We want to recruit more candidates for all teaching programs. And it's helped us establish a military partnership in 4 states. thanks for your attention. We're going to
Got a question.
have a question here.
Can you just ask them?
Certainly.
We've had at least one question texted in. Okay.
Right, so let me read the question. Given that the impact of same race teachers is so significant, what specific ways might you recruit African American males and Pacific Islanders, non-Asian teachers? So there's, across our partners, they have tried 3 specific strategies I'll talk about. And the first one relates to grow your own programs. And it does not mean a school system comes up with a set of processes in order to prepare their own teachers. Our chronically low-performing school systems are struggling to prepare their kids and do not need the sole added pressure of also having to prepare teachers. And so what Grow Your Own programs means is, 1, looking at the alumni or the graduates from your own school system, so products of your own school system. So Newport News Public Schools, for example, looked at all of the products of their own school system and started to figure out where they had gone to university and colleges and what programs they had graduated from, and started reaching out to them, particularly, obviously, minority, underrepresented groups, and enticed them to come back to Newport News Public Schools and go through a non-traditional teacher preparation program that was a partnership between Old Dominion University, William & Mary, and Newport News Public Schools, and some local community organizations. So they were looking at how can they attract back to the school system, take that notion that most teachers end up teaching within 70 miles of their home. We used to think of that as being kind of a bit incestuous or not necessarily a good thing. But if you think about it as being productive, then you're able to increase the number of your African American, particularly males, into your school system through Grow Your Own programs. That's one. The second way that many of our partners in MNET is they've looked at their paraprofessionals. They have gone through the paraprofessionals that are hired. They've communicated with their building principals, and in Ohio we call them the BLTs, the Building Leadership Team, and they've looked to see which of the paras would they tap on the shoulder and say, are you interested in stepping your credentials up to become a licensed teacher, and what are your needs? Mostly it's financial, time, flexibility to be able to take the coursework. And so in that way, they have been able to look at underrepresented groups of particularly paraprofessionals and figure out how can we look at ways to grow our own. And the third has been reaching back out into the community businesses, and looking at, again, those that live locally that may be interested in stepping up to become a teacher. So move from a non-education career into the partnership with the local school system, but it hasn't meant you've got to quit your job and come and be a teacher. It's meant you're interested in moving, making a transition from the business to the school district, and so they've come up with a plan for that to happen. So it may be a phase out over 2 years from their employment with the business while they undertake some of the credentials to becoming a teacher, and then they get hired by the school district. So it's not this quit your job, go cold turkey, and come back in. So those are 3 ways in terms of attracting and, most importantly, retaining, because remember, it's really a retention issue when it comes to underrepresented groups. We're getting them in, we're just not keeping them.
Okay. We're technically out of time, but do we want to take one more question? Did anybody else? People want to stay. All right. There you go.
Yeah. So a couple of you had texted questions, and these are going to be really super fast. So one was for Frank and Robert. If a candidate had to go to a non-high need school, did they not get reimbursed for the coursework then?
No, at that point in time,
Once they leave?
our thing was, we let
Yep.
them make an informed decision.
Got it.
They came back and said, this is my move, and they're an ARTC, but they didn't.
Okay. And then is Haberman specifically to determine suitability for teaching in high need schools, or is it more broadly for teaching in general? It's high need specific. Okay. Those were the only questions I had. So thank you so much.